Okay, Dina, ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. So this is the third in a series of 4 webinars to discuss planning policy, which plays a crucial role in helping to shape the way our area changes in the future. And we're currently consulting on a number of important potential policy changes through the local plan, and this consultation runs until the 18th of February. So it's really good that you've been able to join us today, so that you can help tell us what matters to you in helping to shape future planning policy. So the Council understands that it's challenging to respond to a local plan consultation in the current difficult circumstances within the present restrictions we are putting in place to help make it easy to comment and to publicise and explain the consultations, of which these webinars are an important part. The first webinar was held on the 21st of December. It was to discuss how individuals and communities can get involved in the plan making process. The second webinar last week focused on managing houses in multiple occupation, also known as HMOs. Both webinars were recorded and you can access them through the Council's website. This webinar explores issues around the supply of housing, and it is vital that through the planning system, the Council seeks to ensure a continuous supply of new housing that can be delivered. This is one of the key issues that our partial update of the local plan is addressing, and which we will be discussing today. So for those that don't know me, my name's Dina Romero, and I'm the leader of Bath and North East Somerset Council. And I'd now like to introduce you to the rest of the panel. So first of all, I have Councillor Tim Ball, who is the Cabinet Member for Housing, Planning and Economic Development. I also have Simone de Beer, who is Head of Planning Services, Richard Deon, who is the Deputy Head of Planning and in charge of policy in particular, and Alice Barnes, who is a Planning Officer, so also involved in policy. So I'd now like to turn to Councillor Ball and ask you, Tim, if you could briefly explain why the Council is updating housing policy, is updating housing supply through the local plan, and how the public can be involved in this process.
Yes, thank you. Not only is the Council required by government and national policy to facilitate delivery of housing, but it's important to the Council that it helps ensure needs, including affordable housing, are met. I'll include social housing in that as well. A shortfall of supply in meeting the core strategy requirement has been identified, and this needs to be met with updating the local plan. It's important that supply shortfall is addressed through the plan in order that housing is provided in the right places and in a way that helps best address the climate and ecological emergencies and deliver sustainable development. We are very keen to hear your views on how we propose to replenish housing supply, and the best way to do this by commenting on the local plan partial update by the 18th of February. This webinar will hopefully help answer some of your questions and help you to comment on the document.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm now going to ask Simone to take us through a short presentation, after which we'll have a question and answer session. So can I ask those of you that are attending the webinar, if you want to post some questions into that part of the webinar, and then we'll bring your questions in during the discussion that follows this presentation. So over to you, Simone.
Thank you, Dina. It's going to be only a few slides just to summarise some of the key issues that we've put into a consultation document, and that's available online if you want to see it. We've got some links at the end of this presentation. So just to summarise those points, cover the points on that slide. So the reasons why we feel we need to change the plan now, what the timetable is, what the government requires of us in making changes, what the existing policy states, the framework that we are changing, our past delivery, how we've calculated what the shortfall is, and then how we've sought to address that shortfall, proposed to address that shortfall through the local plan, and what those options are. And just one general point in that conversations like this, we tend to become quite technical and dry in terms of numbers. And I think we haven't lost sight of the fact that what we're talking about really is homes and homes for people, homes for people who need them, affordable homes and a range of homes, and also sustainable homes. So the way that homes are built need to be sustainable and address some of the climate emergency issues. So whilst we tend to get focused a lot on numbers in these sort of discussions, behind the plan are those objectives, and this is the number discussion is a way to facilitate making sure that we've got the right kind of homes in the right places of the right sort to address the homeless problem in the district. Next slide, please, Michaela. So the reason why we need to change the local plan now is that we did a review of the plan in 5 years after it was adopted. So last year we did a review. It was adopted in 2019, as we're required to do. And it came to light a number of policies really do need changing quite soon. And I've listed those there. I won't get into all of those, but one of them was the whole issue around housing land supply and the need to replenish the supply. And I'll explain that in a minute, but you can see it as part of a number of other related policy changes. So the plan does hang together as a whole, and this is one of a series of changes as set out in more detail in the consultation document. Next slide, please, Michaela. On the timetable, the blue boxes in the top are the local plan timetable. We need to go through certain stages in line with government policy. So we're at the options stage. What we've done is we've identified the need for change. We've looked at the new evidence. We've set out some options for people to consider and to feed back to us on. Those will then feed into preparing a draft plan, which is due to be published in the spring for consultation. And that's the first time the council, in light of the need for change, sets out a revised policy approach. And it's really important to engage at this stage, at the formative stage, and also if you've got concerns to comment on the draft plan, because those draft plan comments then become the basis for the examination and inspector. So if you're happy with the plan, that's fine, you can support it. If there's things that we're not happy with, you don't go far enough, it's important that you make those comments then. And any changes to the plan then go, and objections go to an inspector, an independent inspector, who would give his view to the council in terms of what changes are right or wrong to make. And if he feels the council hasn't taken the right approach, that's the time when the inspector would intervene. The plan is supported by supplementary planning documents because not all the detail can go in the plan. So you probably need to watch out for associated supplementary planning documents also and preparation at the same time. And then just so you know, we couldn't do a full review of the plan, it's only a partial review, because we need to wait for the West of England Combined Authority to prepare the new strategic level plan. It's going to take a few years to do. And once that's in place and near completion, we can then review the rest of the policies as shown in that diagram. But in the meantime, we're addressing the most crucial issues and we're making sure that we contain it. If it becomes too large a scope of change, then it becomes a full review. We'll have to wait. And we don't think some of these issues, particularly housing need, climate emergency and nature emergency, can wait for a full review. Next slide, please, Michaela. So in terms of housing requirements, we don't have a blank sheet. We do need to start with the existing plan. We do need to start with the government requirements on us, and they set requirements for planning authorities. And delivery of housing is a very important government priority, and that's expressed very clearly in obligations on local authorities. So all local authorities in their plans must identify the housing need, not just the quantum, but also the type of housing, the amount of affordable housing, and that's a term used in the guidance. So some people think that's not a very good term because some of the lower cost housing isn't affordable, but it gets confusing if we change the terms in the government guidance. But also in terms of the type and the nature. So all of those are requirements on us. We then need to set out a policy to identify a supply of housing, which needs to be reviewed every 5 years as we're doing now. And just to point out, there's a difference between the housing need, i.e. how many houses and homes are needed in a district, and how many that are right to deliver. And those aren't always the same, because sometimes you may need to increase the supply to help affordability, or in some cases to help adjoining authorities who are struggling to meet their need, or you may have too many constraints in your district in terms of green belt or other issues. It means you can't meet that need. And so just bear in mind there's a difference between the identified need and then the actual policy requirement, which where goes into the plan. And then two further points. The government's so keen to make sure that local authorities do deliver on the affordability housing that they test us. They test us first to check we have a 5-year supply. So looking forwards, does the authority have a supply of housing for the next 5 years of deliverable sites? And then secondly, it tests us on deliverability. Have we delivered what we said we would deliver at a certain rate? And on both of those, Baines is a fairly good position at the moment. because of the robust plan, but we do foresee, as I'll show you in a minute, a pending shortfall, which we want to be on the front foot to address, so that we don't end up with a helpful sporadic appeals for housing across the district in a way that's not the best way to plan. So we're foreseeing a problem which we want to address now while we still can do it before it's too late. Next slide, please. That's just the core strategy housing figure. So the current core strategy, the one that we're reviewing, seeks to deliver about 13,000 homes over an 18-year period up until 2029. And you can see there, shown on that slide, the different housing supply in the different parts of the district. Not surprisingly, Bath takes the lion's share, being the largest settlement and the economic driver of the district. And a lot of those have been delivered. So nearly almost over half our houses have been delivered already. There's a sequence in allocating sites. So through the core strategy development, we did look first at focusing on brownfield sites as a priority. And the majority of our sites and development has been on brownfield sites up to now. So Baines has been fairly successful in focusing new homes on brownfield sites. We couldn't meet all of the need on just brownfield sites. So there was a need for some greenfield sites. And looking at sustainable locations at sites like Cambridge on a good transport network, we've tried to avoid dispersal to more peripheral parts of the district of large-scale housing, but there is housing supply in those parts. And some settlements do need housing to keep them alive and to help them function. But we sought to limit housing to unsustainable locations. So there's a sequence, and certainly in looking for supply, there is a sequence of search for sites. Next slide, please, Michaela. And this just shows you the past record of housing completions from 1996. So we did have a period of quite poor delivery in the 90s. Once we got the core strategy in place and released some suitable sustainable sites, you can see that the housing gradually increased to quite high record numbers for Baines, which also included affordable housing delivery and also brought in its still. So it was a infrastructure levy, which is some goes to local communities who get the housing and the rest goes to the district to spend on infrastructure. So there's some very positive sides to good housing delivery in the right places. We'll see from that, the slide goes on to show the forecast. And because we've had quite a good period of delivery to make up for past poor delivery, the delivery in the future is forecast to drop. And that's what we need to replenish in terms of, so we avoid the problems of running out of our housing supply before we renew the plan. So the partial update is an interim measure to fix the supply of housing in the medium to short term to avoid the problem of loss of housing supply. We try to avoid the green belt where we could, but in terms of the supply in the past, but it's not always successful. It's a very high hurdle to go into the green belt. And if you, I'll come to green belt in a minute, just to touch on the next slide, Michaela. So if you look at the way that we identified the housing need, so you can see there it's a fairly mathematical approach. It's given to us in the government guidance, so we don't really have discretion on that, which is helpful because it reduces the areas of dispute. And that calculation there shows that we feel, based on the need, which is an annualized rate, the future need, based on the existing supply, there'll be a shortfall of about 1,200 homes towards the end of the plan period. And that's the figure. Whilst it doesn't seem a huge figure in the context of the 13,000, it is quite important on an annual basis, and it does have implications if we do have an insufficient housing land supply. Next slide, please, Michaela. So what you'll see, if you look at the consultation document, we've set out how we think we can deliver that 1,200 homes. And those blue dots have more detailed maps in the consultation document available online. And you can see that we've sought to follow the sequence of focusing on brownfield sites first before we've gone to greenfield sites. And there, we feel from the work we've done and the evidence we've presented accompanying the document, majority of the 1,200 homes can be found on brownfield sites and beneficially brownfield sites in Bath. We think we can avoid the green belt, and we think we can avoid dispersal to smaller settlements, which generally often generate car usage, but we'll have to see through the examination process whether this is sustainable and whether the inspectors agree with us. We may need some greenfield sites, and I'll come to that in a minute, but there you can see is the proposed location of the new housing sites. On the next slide, those are listed. Michaela, if you go to the next slide, please. So we won't go into those one by one because you can see the information on those in the consultation document. And if you agree with us, or if you don't agree with us, if you've got concerns about those sites, then now's your chance to raise issues, bring in kind of evidence to our attention. But all of those sites we've looked at quite carefully, and we think that we can get around about 1,000 new homes in the Bath area, and then possibly we need another couple of hundred or so on the Greenfield site of the east of Keynsham, which is not in the green belt. So we don't think we need any green belt releases. We don't think we need to spread housing across the district, but all that will be tested. Just so you know, we haven't. This is the proposed options. We haven't come to a conclusion. It'll need to be tested. And then just one last slide, just to show you when I was talking about Keynsham. If you know Keynsham at all, the green is the greenbelt area. The blue land is the existing sites which have been earmarked for development, and the K3 site, K3A sites under development. There was some in the grey notation, some further land taken out the greenbelt, and that's one of the sites we think may come forward. Now the issue there is we may need to release more land than that to enable the infrastructure, but that's part of the consultation process we're going through. And I won't go into the detail now because it's quite complicated, but it's all in the document, in the consultation document. And then lastly, just a reminder, as Dina said on the second last slide, Michaela, the consultation period, there is a detailed document, there is a leaflet, we've got these series of webinars, and you've got the 18th of February as the deadline for making comment. And then we can make these available, I think, online, Michaela, because we've got the last slide shows all the links, which need to be, obviously we need to click those to get access to the different documents.
Thank you very much, Simon. And actually, just picking up on that last point about consultation, obviously we are aware that, these are quite challenging times to be holding consultation. So if anybody wants to send in a letter with their views, then please do so. And obviously, if you are aware of anybody who hasn't got access to the internet, then please ask them to contact us, give the council, send us either, send us an email or perhaps give us a call, and we can make sure that certainly the consultation leaflet can be sent out to you. So I hope that helps, but it is, as I said, quite difficult times to be doing any sort of consultation, which leads me, I guess, onto one question. First off, is why is this process still going ahead? Wouldn't it have been better to have paused it? If I pass that on to Sim first.
Thank you, Dina. We did think about that because we do realise, as Dina said, that some people do struggle to engage online. It's not easy for everybody. And we pondered whether we could pause the consultation, pause the process, and pick it up later on. But for two reasons, we felt that was inappropriate. Firstly, the government is keen and has almost given us instruction to carry on with the plan-making process. It doesn't want to see a delay because the government knows the importance of having up-to-date policies in place. And this plan will address not just the housing supply, but also address some of the climate and nature emergency policies, which are very high priorities, we know, not only for the council, but a large number of our communities. And the current policy framework really doesn't give us a sufficient basis for making decisions. So we do need to get the right planning policy basis in place as soon as we can. And then secondly, if we don't address the housing supply in the way that we think is right and sustainable, the world doesn't stop. You will still get, if housing supply diminishes, we'll still get proposals for development, potentially in the wrong place, in places where we can't get the benefits through infrastructure, and also in places where may not be good for the climate and nature emergency. So on balance, whilst it's difficult for some people, we felt it's right to carry on, and we'll do our best to help people engage. And those who struggle to engage online, as Dina said, we're happy to accept written representations and written comments.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask some sort of more general questions, some of which I know that you referred to in your presentation. So the first question is, what are the housing delivery tests and 5-year housing land supply, and why are they required by government? Perhaps I could pass to Alice to answer that question.
Yep, so those are both requirements that are set by the government. So the housing delivery test looks backwards, essentially. So that is looking at whether you have constructed enough housing within the previous 3 years. and the 5-year land supply looks forward. So that is basically looking at whether you have enough land to meet your housing needs within the next 5 years. So basically both of these are set down by the government. They are mandatory requirements as well. So there's no way of not meeting these requirements. If you don't meet the requirements, there are sort of sanctions imposed. And I think Sim touched upon that earlier about how if we don't meet the housing delivery test or the 5-year land supply, we will lose control over where we can construct housing within the district.
Sorry, I need to unmute. Thank you very much, Alice. Richard, I think this might be a question for you, which is why has the housing land supply shortfall increased from that identified by the council at the time of adopting the placemaking plan?
Yes, thank you, Dina. Yes, at the time of the placemaking plan, when that was examined and when it was adopted, the council felt there was a shortfall of around 350 dwellings or so that arose towards the end of the plan period. However, since then it's increased really for two main reasons. The first really is because since the adoption of the placemaking plan, some of the sites that we anticipated would deliver housing, they will deliver less than we originally anticipated now by 2029. So that includes something like Western Riverside, where whilst it's still delivering housing, it's actually delivering those houses at a slower rate. So that's part of the reason why the supply shortfall has increased. The other reason is really for the reasons that Simon's outlined in the presentation, which is the requirements of the housing delivery test. So when we previously calculated the shortfall, we could make an allowance for, or we could include the faster rate of delivery that had already happened earlier in the plan period. But because of the housing delivery test, we have to deliver that 722 each year. So therefore, we can't take account of the higher rate of delivery earlier in the plan period to the extent that we previously could. And that obviously also has a knock-on impact. So that has meant the shortfall has now increased to around 1,200 dwellings. And that's what we're looking to address through the partial update.
Thank you, Richard. That's really helpful. So I guess, this is another one of those fundamental questions. Why is it so important that the council addresses the housing supply shortfall through its local plan? I think, Sim, can I ask you to answer that perhaps, once you've unmuted?
Thank you, Dina, always. I think for two reasons. One, there is a housing shortage in the district, a housing crisis. And so we do need to make sure we meet those basic needs of people's accommodation. So we need to make sure there's a robust supply of housing, and our evidence shows that we do need the housing. And as from the housing delivery, we can also ask developers to contribute to the affordable housing supply. So it's a way of helping sure that we meet the broad needs of the community in terms of people's needs for homes and housing at the right time. And then secondly, as I think I touched on the presentation, if we don't deliver the housing in a way that's planned and aligned with infrastructure and sustainable and delivers biodiversity net gain and a kind of other issues, we then need to face with a barrage of sporadic housing proposals across the district, as we experienced in 2010-12 when there wasn't a 5-year supply. And whilst that did contribute to the need, it perhaps wasn't always in the right place and wasn't where people needed it and wanted it. So hence the need to maintain control and ensure we have sufficient supply.
Thank you very much, Sim. So I've got just a couple more sort of general questions. So one is about how the council goes about identifying sites to meet its shortfall, and what happens if that shortfall can't be addressed by building in just brownfield sites, and how else other sites might be identified. I think I might take Richard as the volunteer to answer that question.
Thank you, Dina. Yes, I think as Simon again has set out in the presentation, the council does consider that it can meet the supply shortfall mainly through brownfield sites in Bath and in Keynsham. However, as Simon's outlined, we need to do further work on that, and I'm sure we will be challenged on that. There will be other parties putting forward other sites for development. So it may be that we do need to consider greenfield sites. And if we do, we will look at greenfield sites in accordance with the sort of spatial strategy approach that's set out in the core strategy. So that really is seeking to assess and focus greenfield sites in the most sustainable locations, particularly in the south of the district, actually outside the Greenbelt, because government policy pushes us to look at those opportunities outside the Greenbelt first, if you like. So that will mean looking for opportunities at the larger settlements like Midsummer, Norton, Radstock, Westfield, and some of the larger villages that have got a better range of facilities and services and better public transport accessibility to places like Bath and Bristol. Alongside the local plan, the council also prepares something called a housing and employment land availability assessment, and it's required to do that by government. That's the opportunity for landowners, developers, and indeed communities to put forward sites that they think might be suitable for housing and that the council should assess. So in terms of looking at, if we need to look at alternative greenfield sites, then we would use the sites that are on that land availability assessment as the starting point, because those have been put forward, and therefore we have an indication, if you like, that they could be available for development. But just to emphasize, that assessment is just evidence-based. So it's just evidence to inform the plan making process, and the council would need to look at those sites, and if it considers some of those are suitable, we could choose to allocate those through the plan. But at this stage, as I say, we don't feel we need to. If we are going to end up looking at greenfield sites, just to emphasize as well that we would work closely with the communities, and particularly as represented by the parish and town councils in assessing those sites. That's a really important point to get across. The council is very keen to work with communities as closely as possible where greenfield sites are needed.
Thank you very much, Richard. And actually, are we going to be taking into account, sort of the current circumstances? Does the pandemic change, how many houses or, any other matters that might be pertinent to the local plan? And also how much reference will we be making to the census that's due to take place this year?
So because this is, Simon might want to jump in as well. Because this is a partial update to the local plan, it is about identifying sites to deliver the current core strategy requirement rather than actually reviewing that requirement itself. But the council does understand clearly that it will need to review the housing requirement to reflect more up-to-date circumstances and census information, and it will be doing that through and in combination with our colleagues at WECA, West of England Combined Authority, through the spatial development strategy. That will then result in an updated housing requirement stretching further into the future, which again we'll need to plan for through our new local plan. I don't know, Simon, whether you want to add to that at all.
Just very quickly, any housing we identify through this process wouldn't be in addition to the new requirement from WECA. It'll contribute to that. So we're certainly not wasting our time. In fact, we're having a huge benefit by identifying some early delivery housing just to help the supply and make sure people have homes.
So I very nearly didn't unmute myself again then. So thank you very much for that. My apologies for any background noise you might hear. My neighbours are having some work done in their garden. So I'm sort of moving on now to some of the questions that have come up in the question and answer piece and in the question and answer section. So we've got a question here which is about how Bath is constrained by the Greenbelt, and what is its impact then on the ability to create more housing you know, especially as we will all be aware that housing in some parts of the city itself are have been converted into student housing or into HMOs that also serve professional people as well as our student population. So I wondered if someone could give us an answer on how will the local plan update address that type of issue?
If I make a start, and then perhaps others can step in if they want to add to it. I think the key point to make it is that we acknowledge that Bath has a huge range of assets which make it a special place, and those do have constraints on the location of housing. So we're difficult to try and expand Bath outwards because of its setting, its natural beauty and the wildlife sites and landscape impact. But we did manage through the core strategy to identify some sites which are sustainable and did fit in well with the nature of Bath. So those are in the core strategy. We do think, along with government guidance, the need to focus on brownfield sites first, and that we've been fairly successful in Bath. So if you look at the figures, and when I last looked at them, well over half all the houses built in the district were on brownfield sites. And so we've managed, but Bath as a kind of city where it is fairly dynamic, despite its heritage, there are opportunities for growth. The key thing is to make sure the sites are deliverable. So you can't just earmark a site for housing and then it just sits there, nothing happens. And we do experience that sometimes with sites which seem to have some kind of hope or potential, haven't come forward as we'd hoped. And so that means that it hence need for review and to keep constantly on top of it. But we also then need to look at the role of the other settlements in the district. And we did see Keynsham as playing a role which is well placed to help deliver the district's housing needs. And so the majority of the housing supply in the district was at both Bath and Keynsham, but all parts of the district did take their fair share in the core strategy. But we go through that sequence again, as I said in the presentation, looking for new sites, bearing in mind this balance between the constraints you've got to weigh in, plus also respecting the need that we do need homes. I don't know whether anyone wanted to add to that, Richard or Thomas.
Yes, I can do. I think that the question also raises, I suppose, the implications for the housing stock of some family homes being lost to HMOs or houses in multiple occupation and short-term lets. In terms of HMOs, yes, the council is looking to address that through both the partial update of the local plan, but also by reviewing its HMO supplementary planning document in order to help try and manage the implications of over-concentration of HMOs in certain parts of the city. So I would encourage people to read the local plan partial update options document, but also there was a webinar specifically on that topic last week, which, as you've said, Dina, is available on the council's website to view. In terms of short-term lets, yes, the council is aware, and there is evidence, there's an increasing number of properties that are being made available as short-term lets for holiday use, etc. So we are aware of that is an issue. We need to do further work really and get further evidence on the extent to which that is having an impact on the housing stock. I.e., is it just parts of those properties that are used as short-term lets or the complete properties? There's also an issue really there in terms of what the planning system is able to do about that issue. Currently, short-term holiday lets are basically the same use class as a family home, so it makes it very difficult for the planning system to address it, although there are signs that the government is re-looking at that issue and things might be changing on that, and therefore the council will wait until, if you like, the government has looked at the issue as well and whether the planning system might change, and then we will propose to look at the issue through our new local plan, which we'll start work on later this year, rather than seeking to address it through the partial update.
Thank you. I don't know, Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add onto the comments from officers?
Not at this stage, but the officers covered it pretty well.
Thank you, Tim. So, and obviously Bath isn't the only place where we need housing, we need affordable housing, and we need housing that is in sustainable locations. So, does the local plan actually look at housing, future housing provision in North East Somerset in terms of how sustainable those locations are. Looks at existing roads and existing infrastructure when it's developing its case as it builds that for the future. So I see Alice is nodding, so I'm going to bring Alice in.
Yes, so when we're looking at sites that we're identifying to be allocated, we're basically doing a thorough assessment of all the opportunities and the constraints of all the sites. So this would include whether it's in a sustainable location, how accessible it is by road, by bus, by cycle paths, etc. And then we also work with specialists within the authority to look at constraints such as green infrastructure, biodiversity, etc. And then we use that analysis to set out the development requirements of a site and whether it should be allocated. And then in order to ensure it's viable, we undertake viability testing as well.
Thank you, Alice. And I think that leads quite neatly into the next question that I think has been mentioned a few times in the question and answer section, which is about how do we ensure that affordable housing is actually delivered? What tools do we have, and does the local plan refresh actually help in assuring that need is met?
I can start off. The local plan plays part of the role there. So housing is quite a complex process to deliver, and the council doesn't deliver houses like they used to in the old days with council housing. What the local plan can do is make sure there's sufficient overall supply, and then require as part of that supply that some of those houses, and in our case, it's between 30 and 40%, are affordable homes and stay as affordable homes through the rigid landlord approach. And so I think that's the main contribution we can do to the planning system. We also get SIL, as I said before, which helps to contribute not to affordable homes, but to other infrastructure issues around supporting those homes. Did you want to add to that, Richard or Alice?
Only very briefly, just to say that in allocating the sites through the draft plan, we will be undertaking viability testing to make sure that the sites can be brought forward in a financially viable way, including delivering affordable housing. But just to pick up on that sort of affordable housing, the sort of 30 and 40%, that relates to sites of a certain size. So primarily that's sites that will deliver 10 or more dwellings. And I notice in the chat, there's a question around affordable housing provision in villages has been raised, and particularly on the smaller sites. Now, the issue there is, whilst the core strategy requires or we seek to negotiate some affordable housing on sites delivering between 5 and 9 dwellings, actually national policy, if you like, has overtaken that. So the government now says that you can only, or the council can only seek affordable housing on sites providing less than 10 dwellings in what it calls designated villages, defined villages. And unfortunately, from our perspective, the government's definition of those villages is limited to villages within either the Cotswolds or the Mendip Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. So that at the moment does limit our ability to secure affordable housing on some of those smaller infill sites in villages outside the areas of outstanding natural beauty. We have raised that with government and we continue to do so in order to try and get a change to that definition so that it would apply to a broader range of villages. But that's unfortunately is the current position nationally.
Thank you, Richard. So there's been a few other questions that are around rural development and sustainable development. And I guess one of those possibly unanswerable questions is about if the site is considered sustainable because it currently has a rural bus service, is there any guarantee that that bus service will continue into the future? And I guess aligned to that is the role that WECA plays in delivering the integrated travel and transport infrastructure, as well as the role it plays in that joined up piece of work around housing provision for the whole of the WECA region. So it's quite a complex question. So I see Richard has smiled, so I'm going to choose Richard first.
Thank you, Dina. I mean, you're right. That is a complex and quite a difficult question. I think in terms of the partial update, as we've said, we really are focusing on identifying brownfield sites in Bath and Cambridge in particular, in the main urban areas. However, you know, yes, it is acknowledged there is a need to consider the housing requirements and needs of villages, and to make sure that any sites that do come forward in those areas are sustainable and brought forward in a planned way. I think we're going to have to look at that issue in more detail through the new local plan. And I agree with you, Dina, that is very much related to the work that the West of England Combined Authority will do, not only on its spatial development strategy, but also in terms of infrastructure funding, because clearly the council, you know, hasn't got control over all rural bus services, and we can't sit here and guarantee that those services will continue into the future. But that is something, you know, working with WECA that we need to look at in transport terms, and make sure that our transport strategy aligns with our planning strategy. But as I say, that's something we'll be looking at in more detail through our new local plan. I don't know whether you want to add to that, Simon, at all, or indeed Tim.
Well, I know Tim's got his hand up, so I'm going to turn to Tim first, who also sits on the WECA committee. Sits on the WECA board, for housing.
Yes, lovely. Thank you very much. Sustainable development is obviously very important, particularly in rural areas. Ensuring proper transport links are obviously in place properly. Of course, we cannot guarantee a commercial bus service will still run after the event takes place. But in all future developments, particularly on the larger scale, we're looking to ensure sustainable development, ensuring developments on major transportation corridors where possible. I understand villages obviously also need to have actual housing going in, particularly affordable stroke social housing as well, to ensure the village can survive itself. And working transportation policies through linked to housing development is obviously very essential in the future, that we actually try and marry these up. There was a comment I see in the chat just now regarding the JLT. I've lost my thread completely. Concerning the JSP, which actually failed, and the replacement with the strategic development scheme of WECA. Yes, it's important we actually pursue down that particular route. The government requires us to actually work on strategic plans across the region, and these will then feed into our local plan, which comes later. But we're currently on a refresh at the moment, and comments obviously required on what we're doing on that particular level.
If I can also just, sorry, Dina, if I can also just add in terms of the villages, as I've already said, it's really important that we work with the local communities, particularly as represented by the parish council. So, you know, I think there's a need for local needs evidence and local needs surveys to be done. And again, if there are parishes, parish councils that want to assess the need for the different types of housing in their communities, and they want to undertake a needs survey, then they should really get in contact with ourselves, and particularly our housing enabling team, you know, who hopefully can support them in that work.
Thank you, Richard. And I assume, you know, that piece of work then might lead to a neighbourhood plan. So what is the role of neighbourhood plans in this? How much notice does the council in updating its local plan refresh take of those neighbourhood plans, and what happens if there aren't neighbourhood plans? You know, is it possible to consider sites, sustainable sites, without a neighbourhood plan?
Yeah, there's a number of questions there. Neighbourhood plans do form part of the development plan, so therefore, you know, they get the full statutory weight in terms of determining planning applications. So, you know, in that respect, they're treated in the same way as the local plan. In preparing neighbourhood plans, we work with parish councils and try to make sure that they do align with our local plan, because that is one of the tests, if you like, against which they are assessed. In terms of considering future sites for development, again, there's two options. Either parish councils and communities can work with us in terms of allocating sites through the local plan, and that worked very well when we were preparing the placemaking plan. Or alternatively, as you say, they can actually identify and allocate sites through the neighbourhood plan. So there's either route is open to them. Neighbourhood plans are very useful in providing that extra level of detail in terms of, you know, local and sort of village and community specific issues, which perhaps it's difficult for us to pick up in the local plan. But you know, it's not an absolute requirement that communities do it, but if they're able to, I would strongly encourage them to progress a neighbourhood plan.
Tim.
Yes, echo Richard's actual comments. Neighbourhood plans are very important about North East Somerset Council. I think we're one of the most advanced authorities in the area regarding neighbourhood plans. I know our neighbouring authority, South Gloucester, doesn't have any at all. So basically, neighbourhood plans help to formulate the housing policy in the rural area and allow for sustainable development to take place as required by those communities. So it's very important if people do not have a neighbourhood plan, they start the process and ask for help in starting that if need be.
Thank you, Tim. So I've got a couple of questions that have come up around deliverability, and some of that is around, you know, viability as well. And so I'll read this question, which is: developers often cite viability reasons for their failure to meet AH required percentages. So is stronger policy required to enforce policy? So I feel that's possibly a Sim question.
Or did Alice, you want to pick the one up, Alice?
Or Alice, yes.
I think that might be better fielded by Sim.
Okay. It is an issue of viability, and it is an issue where we need to consider. The government has changed the planning policy a few years ago just to emphasise the point that the question asks, and that really it shouldn't be an excuse for developers not providing the affordable housing policy requirement that we're asking, the 30 to 40%. And so we feel robust on asking that, and we do really push the developers hard. But if it does mean it gets to a point where the overall site is prejudiced, we do need to bear that in mind in terms of making the decision. So in terms of our development management colleagues who determine planning applications, they do try as hard as they can to make sure the developers comply. And we've been fairly successful in delivery of affordable housing, not as much as we would like, but we've made a target of about, I think, 3,000 affordable homes in the course of this year, which we're well onto the way to delivering. And it doesn't seem a lot, but to the planning system, I think we've been quite successful.
So can somebody just take us through, just very briefly, the process? So a developer, you may claim that the site is no longer viable for them to deliver affordable housing. Then what happens?
What we ask, we really give them a lot of pressure. So we ask them at their own expense to prepare a viability assessment. And we have to acknowledge there are lots of pressures on housing sites. We're asking them to provide biodiversity, the right infrastructure, affordable homes, good design, sustainable places. We are asking them for a fair bit. But if they struggle to deliver on any of those, we ask for a viability assessment. And I think Alice will correct me because she's experienced in this. If we then get our own independent assessment of viability, just to make sure that we think that it is robust, and that if they are genuinely saying there's an issue where they can't quite meet all the policy requirements, that's proven and shown through the evidence. And so after that process, if we feel that something needs to give, and we try to avoid the affordable housing being the area that gives, then that's the grounds where we may waver on the policy requirements.
And just to add to that, national government again is trying to get to a point where, if you like, the viability of what the council is asking for on a site is tested at the plan making stage rather than so much at an individual application stage. So it's really important through the partial update that for the sites we're proposing to allocate, that we do that viability testing very thoroughly, which we will do. So that again will determine, can we deliver the 30 or 40% affordable housing, but also can we viably deliver things like the biodiversity net gain requirement, zero carbon development, and all of the other things that we're aiming to achieve as a council. So that viability testing work will be undertaken in preparing the draft plan.
Just to emphasise the point, what that does do then, Dean, in terms of the policy side, it pushes down the price of land that people pay for land. So if they know they're going to have all these requirements on them, they will then not overpay for the land, and that's what sucks out some of the ability for them to meet some of the requirements. So having that requirement clear at the policy stage, then when they get to the planning application, they've built all of that into their figures, so they know then what the policies are and they can meet those policies.
Thank you, Sim. Alice and then Tim.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, sorry, I
sorry.
thought that you were going to come in. Tim.
Yeah, I think it's very important developers realise if they pay too much for a site and can't manage the viability, then it's very clear the council doesn't take a very light view on that. And planning applications that come in when people change their minds and try and say it's not viable now are automatically referred to the Development Control Committee for determination. Because basically some people then just clearly pay too much what they're buying, and they get caught later on. So issue is, look at what you're buying, think of what you're buying before you do it.
Thank you, Tim. I think that's very, very wise words. So I'm going back to the question and answer just to see if there's any things that we haven't really covered. So just going back to the term affordable. So I think it gets bandied around quite a lot. We all agree, I think, that certainly in Bath and North East Somerset, affordable as a definition of housing is a bit of a misnomer. What tools do we have? What ability do we have to use some different term?
It is a bit of a misnomer. One of the most expensive parts of the west of England, and possibly in the country in terms of people's income compared with house prices. The difficulty we have is that the government offers subsidy and grants based on its own definition of what it calls social housing or affordable rent, or whether it introduced a new starter homes type approach. And all of those have got finance attached. So we could try to be helpful to use more appropriate and more descriptive terminology in BANES, which we can do. The difficulty is that may lead to confusion. You have a lot of terms and banding about, and people then get very confused how our terms relate to the government's terms. So because of that, we've tried then generally to stick to the national terminology, but being clear what we mean. And there are differences there in terms of different categories of affordability, as I say, the good old-fashioned social rent as opposed to the other rent tenures, and also the starter homes and the shared ownership. I think at the back of the plan, Rich, we may publish a glossary which describes what these are. And if not, certainly we can do in the draft plan we're going to publish in March. So these people are clear what we mean when we use these terms.
Thank you, Sim. I'm just checking if anybody was about to add in anything there. Okay, so we're now sort of coming to the end of this this webinar. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn if there's any sort of additional take-home messages they want to share with our audience today, and if they've noticed anything in the questions that have been put forward that we haven't picked up. I've tried to steer away from any site-specific questions, but if there's sort of general comments that panelists want to raise, then this is your moment. So I'm going to start with Alice and work through the officers and end with Tim, if that's okay.
I think it's just important to flag that as you've been listening to this presentation, if you feel that either a site we've identified for housing you feel it won't deliver sufficient housing, or you think there is a better site, then please do get involved and respond to the consultation. You can also submit sites to be included in our housing and economic land availability assessment, and you can do that through our website, and there are details on the website of how to do that. Or if you have already submitted a site and you want to update details, then obviously please do so as well.
Thank you very much, Alice. Richard.
Yep, just to add to that, really, without talking about specific sites, you know, the council will be doing further work on the sites we've listed in the options document to set out the requirements of development and to make sure that we are making the best use of those sites, the most efficient use of that brownfield land. Again, you know, if people have got comments on specific issues that they think should be picked up in relation to those sites, again, it would be very useful to hear those now. That will include looking at the amount of land, for example, that is set aside for the parking of cars on those sites. And again, I'm aware that that's an issue that a lot of people do raise. And just to flag up that alongside the local plan update, we will be reviewing the parking standards. And we will actually be putting those into a separate supplementary planning document. And we'll consult on those draft parking standards, hopefully alongside the draft plan in the spring. So again, those are aimed at trying to make sure the parking is at appropriate levels, commensurate with the, if you like, the sustainability of a location. So those locations that are more accessible by public transport and walking and cycling, you know, the parking standard should be less. There should be less parking provided on those sites. So again, keep an eye out for that consultation, and please let us have your views on that, as well as the local plan partial update and the sites we've identified there. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you, Richard. Sim.
Just very briefly, I saw in the chat somebody asked if they can see all the call for sites responses that we've received from the community, and yes, you can. They're all published. They're alongside the consultation document on the website. And just to reiterate what Richard said, that's purely just what people have submitted for consideration. None of those have any weight until they go through a plan making process. But they're all there if you want to see which ones have been submitted over the last 6 months or so, a few months.
Thank you, Sim. And Tim.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very important now everybody has their say on this particular refresh of local plan. If you have comments, please make sure you submit them and get them in as soon as possible. If you have questions that you ask and haven't been answered, please let us know and we'll make sure the answers have got to you. I see comments in the chat that haven't had their questions answered. We'll endeavour to make sure responses are given.
Thank you, Tim. And yes, just repeating that message, you know, if you've already raised a question and we've not been able to answer it during this session, then we will endeavour to get an answer to you, and any additional comments will be taken into account in the consultation. But I think the important message is for us to hear from you. So please make sure that you respond to the consultation. Please make sure that if you're aware of people who can't respond online, that you let us know, or that they let us know, and we will endeavour to help them to submit their response. You know, this, I hope, has been a helpful webinar for you. I think it's been, you know, we've covered quite a wide range of different elements in this particular piece of the webinar. And as I said, this forms part of a kind of package of webinars that are directly related to the consultation on the local plan refresh. So if you're interested in some of those other webinars, please look at the council's website, and also look at the council's own YouTube channel, which is where you will find access to all of our webinars that we've held on a wide range of subjects in the last year. So thank you everybody for your time at this webinar. Thank you to all my panelists and to everybody who's worked behind the scenes to make sure that this webinar is as successful as it can be. So thank you everybody, and I hope to see many of you at our next